Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this episode of Trade Winds, where we're going to talk about BRICS. It's the last Trade Winds for the year. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I am a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington. Political leaders from almost 30 countries met in Kazan, Russia, almost 2 months ago. They were there to discuss future cooperation in the BRICS format, and the Russians host, they hoped for a discussion or maybe even a decision on an alternative payment system to the dollar. The theme of the summit was strengthening multilateralism for a just global development and strategy. And apart from the BRICS actual members, many other countries were invited, some as potential new members and others as observers. But what kind of network or organization is BRICS? What does it hope to achieve? Are we seeing a more coordinated alternative approach to the global order? Can it become the voice of the global South? These are the few questions I will discuss with my panel today, and I am very proud to present three extraordinary speakers to you. We have Mr. Ayabonga Dawe, Chief Commissioner from the International Trade Administration Commission in South Africa and member of the Presidential Economic Advisory Council. We have Dr. Tanvi Madan from the Center for Asia Policy Studies, Foreign Policy Program at Brookings Institute, and author of many books about Indian foreign policy and other matters. And Dr. Michaela Papa, Director of Research for International Studies at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, Boston, who has also published a lot on BRICS and sustainable development. So you're all very welcome. BRIC was born as an acronym used by Goldman Sachs in 2001 as a way to define countries as potential emerging drivers for growth: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. They gathered for the first time in 2006, and in 2009 there was actually a summit in Russia on highest level, presidential or prime minister level. 1 year later, in 2010, South Africa became a member, and then BRICS. And there was also a forum created, a kind of international organization aiming to promote political, cultural, and economic cooperation among the countries. But it's not really a formal organization. It has no statute, no secretariat, no budget, no headquarter, but it has grown as a network who reflects the country's maybe lack of agency or perceived lack of agency in a Western-dominated international finance and government system. And it has become the symbol of what's next in international cooperation, not led by the West. Membership have also grown. Today, also Egypt, Ethiopia, United Emirates, and Iran are members, and others are seeking closer cooperation. And the 10 members today represent 36% of global GDP and 45% of global population, so it's not negligible. But it seems like different countries also have different ambitions within the cooperation, and there was no real agreement, at least not on an alternative payment system in Kazan. So what is BRICS and what can it become? Michaela, why don't you start to give us an overview of this strange animal?
Thank you so much for inviting me. So BRICS is a bit complex. It's let's start with the mission and then membership and then mechanisms. So in terms of mission, BRICS is an intergovernmental association of countries that seek to basically rethink how international system works and how can one make it more multipolar and inclusive and better reflect the contemporary economic and political realities. And then, in particular, improve the functioning of international financial and economic architecture, meaning decision-making, agendas, implementation, but also serve common interests of emerging market economies and developing countries. So there is a lot of cooperation among BRICS countries themselves that's not necessarily externally oriented. In terms of membership, the group started as an independent entity in 2009, and then basically had 3 enlargements. The first enlargement from BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, was South Africa was added. And then it was 2011. Then 2024, there are 4 other members: Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, UAE, and Saudi Arabia is still a question mark. It's considering membership. But then 2 months ago in Kazan, there was a new category called partner country category. And it's not really formal yet which countries will be partner countries. We know that 13 countries are in the mix, and they include also very big economies, Indonesia, Nigeria, Turkey, and so on. Overall, when we look at the mechanism through which BRICS operates, it operates through country presidencies. So, for example, now it's Russia's presidency. We are moving on to Brazil presidency. There is a flagship summit once in a year. And there is almost like an iceberg. There is a lot of activity throughout the year. So this year it's around 200 events where different members of working groups, different experts coordinate joint policies. Unlike many other groups, BRICS started a new development bank, so an international organization that approved cumulative loans of around 35 billion by now. So it is in a way like a hybrid institution, unlike any other currently in global governance.
Wow, that's a lot. We'll deconstruct some of it as we talk along. Tanvi, from India's perspective, India was there from the beginning. Why is it so important, and what does India see coming out of it for the benefit of the country?
First, thank you, Cecilia, for inviting me for this Peterson Institute panel. It's great to be with all of you. I think I'll start with what you talked about, that India was a founding member of BRICS. And the reason that it initially joined was in the context of that time, which is that India felt that it was not that existing institutions of the international order weren't very representative, not just of India, but were of developing country emerging market views, so of today what we would call also the global South. And so for India, this was an opportunity, as was, for example, the Russia, India, China trilateral that preceded that, of a non-West platform that helped not just highlight the lack of representativeness of existing institution, but potentially, gave India a platform to help reform in a collective or collaborative way those institutions, highlight some of the developmental issues, some of the economic issues that were being brought up. So a lot of this was about, for India, a non-West organization or grouping that brought up issues that were important to India. It was also important, something Mihaela mentioned, for India, which believes or wants to see a multipolar world, for a way for India to ensure that it was maintaining its kind of diversified portfolio of partners. You see this over the last kind of 15, 20 years, India's relationships and interests with and activities with the West have grown considerably, but India wants to keep the other relationships it has with Russia, with at one point China, and with other countries in the developing world and emerging markets, wants to keep those relationships. So this was about being anti-West. It was about multipolarity as well. It was also about India's growing preference now, and this has particularly been the case in the last 5 or so years, India's preference for these informal coalitions, what India calls plurilaterals, what some call mini-laterals, which is interest or issue-based groupings. But that also meant this is not the only one grouping that India participates in. India is also a member of the quadrilateral with Australia, India, Japan, the US, which arguably India has more strategic convergences with. But just to say that this is one of the various groupings that India is a part of. So it does not see this as exclusive within its own foreign policy, or even necessarily as having a special place in it. Just a couple of other things. I think for India, this was also to some extent about finding a way, as Russia became less relevant for India's various interests. It was largely a relationship depending on kind of defense, trade and technology ties. This was one way of continuing to engage with Russia, a platform that helped India continuing to find a way to keep Russia also in its fold and not go all the way to bandwagoning with China. And then finally, for India, not only was this a way for India to continue to engage with and help represent the views of the developing world, but it was also a way to ensure that China didn't portray itself as the only voice of the global South, so to speak, or try to dominate the agenda of the grouping. And so you see India spend, I suspect, a considerable time in drafts trying to ensure that you're not seeing, a China-dominated agenda or joint statement, for instance, ensures that there isn't endorsement of things like initially the Belt and Road Initiative, now kind of the Global Development Initiative, and others. That just my final point. It also, though, gives you a preview of some of the things that have limited what India's participation in BRICS, or what it sees as the potential, which is India's intensifying competition with China. India is now, earlier used to see China as a partner in the developing world. Now it sees itself as competing for influence in the developing world with China. But you also see, therefore, India's concerns about BRICS expansion and the way it's taken place, even as that BRICS expansion will ensure that India will continue to participate in the organization because it will have that larger voice potentially.
So it's both to control China a little bit, but also to make sure that India and China are there together to speak on behalf of the global South when appropriate, and to formulate the kind of other version or a new multipolar version of the global order. That must be quite a difficult balancing act sometimes to both control China but also cooperate.
India is used to difficult balancing acts, and I think that actually puts it perfectly. I often think of kind of India's BRICS balancing act. I would say, though, they're careful about, I don't think, you have especially Indian officials be careful to say they don't seek to say that they speak for the entire global South, just that they are one voice of it, knowing that there are others in the global South. And for India in this, they find Brazil and South Africa as much more like-minded than Russia and China. And I think you're seeing this more with BRICS expansion. I think you're seeing both within BRICS, but also outside BRICS, IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, doing a little bit more with each other. In part, I suspect, because at least for Brazil and India for a while, one concern was that with this expansion, and you heard this in Prime Minister Modi's closing remarks at the Kazan summit, with the expansion, it has the potential to reduce the role and influence of the founding members, and particularly for India, the case, they're concerned about India, Brazil, and South Africa losing some role and influence, or that being diluted because of not just the dominance of China, but the expansion that didn't follow any kind of membership criteria as such. And so you do see some of that, and you see what you will see, I think, with expansion for India is, working within. So this is an informal coalition of sorts, or more formalized than before, grouping. But now, even within this, I suspect what you'll see as India tries this balancing act is continue to participate, continue to deepen its involvement in some ways, but also then find like-mindeds on particular issues. Perhaps Brazil on some issues, perhaps the UAE, which India is very close to, perhaps South Africa on some issues, and try to ensure that even Russia doesn't go over entirely towards bandwagoning with China and setting that agenda.
Interesting. We'll come back to new membership in a little while. Ayabonga, what's the view from South Africa? You came in a little bit later than the founding, but still has been around for quite some time. Also a member of different other organizations, G20, that you're sharing right now. How do you see BRICS from the Pretoria point of view?
Thank you very much, Cecilia, and thank you once again for the invitation. I certainly would say that as South Africa, we hold no pretensions to holding anybody in line, or kind of keeping check the relative power of any sovereign nation. I think for us, really, in South Africa, the joining of BRICS is very much part of a continuous and evolving tradition, decades-long traditions of solidarity. And certainly in our own country, both against apartheid and settler colonialism, but seemingly also, I think, over time, over certainly close to the last century, South Africa has the irony of having been also an author, or the Dominion of South Africa, then the author of the League of Nations. And so in a way, we're a founder member. But similarly, I think we are also a founder member of many other global bodies, the non-aligned movement being one. And certainly joining the BRICS is part of that long-standing tradition of an ongoing critique, least of all within the dominant political traditions of South Africa, ongoing critique of the organization and configuration of the international order in its multiple dimensions. And I think much of the focus has certainly been on the financial side. But certainly within BRICS, you'll see that there's a multiplicity of areas of cooperation. And I'm glad that Tanvi has also raised that indeed we also are countries that have our own dynamic of competition among ourselves in line with that cooperation. We're a small open market economy, vulnerable very much to not just the vagaries of that competition, but also the organization of global affairs. And so in a sense, we have existential interest in the reform of the multilateral order, coming as we do from these traditions. And so BRICS in a way is part of that. But BRICS is also part of that in a much more contemporary sense, in that we recognize, as much as the kind of post-war prime minister in the United Kingdom, Clement Attlee, did, that you can't have a world where relations between one country and the next are defined by naked competition or naked expression of self-interest. And that indeed, if we all want to live in any society, we are going to have to organize our affairs in a way where we are able to cede certain kind of dominion over our own affairs and those of others, and to collaborate on issues of common concern. And so BRICS, very much at its nascent phase, because you go to a tariff book, you're not going to find a BRICS kind of horizontal line or anything like that. So very much still a body of cooperation, very much in the building. But certainly it is quite clear if one looks not just at the Kazan declaration, but even the Johannesburg one last year, that a big part of the reform agenda, yes, is about representation in global platform and fora, but similarly, it's also about structural questions. How do you think differently, for instance, about the flows of capital, both for aid purposes and development purposes? How do you think within global value chains about how price risks are shared? And to what degree do kind of macroeconomic balances of power between countries, among regions, and between blocs influence whether people are able to really survive, whether people starve or not, whether people have shelter? And so in a sense, South Africa joins BRICS not only for those altruistic reasons, but also very much existentially because of our own structural position and history, coming as we do from a country, as I said, that's a small open market economy where alliances are important, but also where trade and cooperation and interaction with many other countries is important as well.
And South Africa, as you mentioned, is part of so many other different international organizations and so on. And now you will be sharing the G20. Can these different membership also reinforce each other? Do you see, for instance, the G20 activities reinforcing the BRICS or the other way around to try to find in some areas a common agenda?
Well, our understanding, and I think if you read any of the two declarations I've mentioned, and also read our G20 statements following our presidency, which began a few days ago, you'll see that for us, none of these memberships and participation in many of these forums diverge from our principled position. We are against a global order, as I said, that's defined by naked competition. We are against a global order that is against human rights. But similarly, we express concern about the use of unilateral measures. We are in favor of multilateralism. And so in no way for us is there a contradiction in being members of many of these bodies, least of all those from the global south, from whom we share many, many similar experiences. And I think, Tanvi spoke to some of these issues, but so too do we share a common interest with many of the members in BRICS and even other members of the Group of 20 around comprehensive reform of the multilateral system. We don't take a view that we must throw the baby out with the bathwater, proverbially, but that really we are interested in what for us has been a decades-long program of reforming the global multilateral fora and other fora where people cooperate to solve problems, be those around security, be those around food, be those around kind of issues of human rights or the extension of democratic freedoms to all.
Gaila, you've been following this for a very long time, and now we don't have any representatives from neither China, Russia, or Brazil. But how would you say that BRICS has developed during this time with all the geopolitics playing in as well? I mean, obviously there are some common interests where the group can work together in BRICS, but also in other fora. But there is also a lot of geopolitics, and especially in this world today with growing conflicts, the US-China conflict, we have the war in Ukraine. How much is geopolitics defining the organization today?
Question for me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Easy.
So I started working on BRICS maybe even more than 10 years ago. And initially, when I saw BRICS, I always thought about it as sustainable development partnership, as strategic partnership to ensure that there is sustainable development and to basically rethink the system so that it's not kind of the old structures from after the Second World War. So, but the way I saw the evolution over time, I saw that basically the process allowed each of the countries to bring the issues that they were passionate about. So it wasn't necessarily major geopolitical issues. I mean, there were issues like air pollution for the environmental working group. So there were very many different issues. And then over time, we did like a whole like BRICS convergence index to look at around which issues BRICS were mostly gathering. And when you look at that, like industrial development is a very big issue all BRICS countries were very interested in. Development finance, another issue, agriculture, health. So there are certain areas that have been like ongoing streams. And then there are areas that emerge over time. So security was not a big area starting in 2009, but then eventually through Brazil presidency, through India, the counterterrorism dimension came in. And then where we actually see a big jump in cooperation, it's 2014, 2015, around Russia, and basically Russia pivoting more strongly toward BRICS, Russia-China cooperation getting stronger, and especially now with Ukraine, with Gaza, there has been this geopolitical momentum that has been much stronger. So not only the economic cooperation, but also willingness to discuss conflict, and before it was very much behind red lines. So one of the big things in terms of lately that I've seen is this effort for conflict resolution, especially the effort to bring India and China closer in terms of how the group, like India and China conflict within BRICS was in a way a defining feature for like why like a big barrier. And over time, there has been a sense of these two countries growing closer, working together, compartmentalizing the issues that divide them. And now finally with Kazan, before Kazan summit, having like a border breakthrough. So there are different dimensions. And of course, moving away from the dollar, that is probably the most geopolitically relevant dimension when somebody is in the United States thinking about the future of the dollar.
Yes, so that was also what Russia wanted very much to have on the agenda in the preparatory meeting before Kazan with the finance ministers and so on. It was discussed and they were given the task to look closer into it. Now, I understand that nothing really concrete happened. There was a discussion, but there wasn't any concrete. And there was also discussion as on developing a much fairer agricultural trading system. I thought that was quite one of the big topics coming out. And the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, was there, which gave the whole meeting some sort of legitimacy, or you know that he was there. I think he hasn't in the past. So what will happen with these proposals on the alternative payment system, on the alternative or more fairer rather agricultural trading system? What's the next step? Tanvi or Ayabonga?
Sure. I think this is where you do see some of the contradictions within BRICS members' interests diverge, and where it actually ends up affecting the outcomes that you can expect. It was clearly Russia who was driving, especially this idea of a BRICS currency. You saw, Russian officials in the lead up try to announce something. But you also saw not that much interest from some others. There was a BRICS finance minister that Russia hosted, finance ministers meeting, and most of the countries' finance ministers didn't turn up for it. The Indian foreign minister was very clear that India has zero interest in de-dollarization or that agenda, while saying that India would be interested in and has a current interest in trade in national currencies, partly for a couple of reasons. One, pointing out that some countries don't have dollar reserves, some member states, and so that's something that was useful. And second, pointing out, and this has come up after U.S. President-elect Trump made some comments about de-dollarization. You've heard India point out, one of the reasons people have turned to non-dollar mechanisms is what countries like India see as unilateral sanctions that end up not being targeted at countries like India, but countries like India being their interests being affected, their ability to trade with other countries being affected by those sanctions. And India doesn't just say this as an abstract. India says this is a country that has been on the receiving end of sanctions itself. And so you do see, I think, India interested in things like trade in national currency, though the bulk of Indian trade is still in dollars or euros or other methods. But you don't see an interest in, for example, a BRICS currency. And a lot of that, and also in some other kind of BRICS economic packages, and a lot of that has to do with the continuing, as much as India and China yes, did have a meeting. They aren't growing closer because for India, actually, they don't think that you can separate geopolitics and economics anymore. And a lot of their economic problems are actually with China. So one of the reasons they will never agree to a BRICS currency is they think it will largely lead to more Chinese dominance, and they don't think the Chinese central bank is very transparent, or that you could actually practically have a BRICS currency that is, for example, linked to the yuan, given that currency's limitations. And I'll give you an instance. Even when India has been buying Russian oil, the Russians have asked them for the priority currency that Russia has asked them for is dollars. Second choice has been, yuan and dirham. But even Russia at the BRICS summit said they would the only currencies that could be traded at their banks were dollars and euros. So I think there are limitations in this regard, but I would not underestimate the frustration that many countries have with the second and third order effects on their economies, on their development of sanctions that are imposed in the West.
The sanctions imposed vis-a-vis Russia because of their invasion of Ukraine, you mean?
I think this is the latest iteration, but I think this is a long-standing issue. So, for example, you'll have a country like India say, you impose sanctions on Iran and told us to stop buying oil there. So we said, fine. And we started diversifying, including to Venezuela. Then you impose sanctions on Venezuela and say, don't buy oil from there. But we have people, we need to, give our citizens energy security. And for India, that's not just reliable energy, but that's affordable energy. And so then, you see kind of an India then turning to Russia. And obviously, oil imports are not sanctioned, but they do see, for example, the sanctions on Russia increasing just the latest reflection of this. This is not a new issue that India has had with sanctions. And I would argue this is one of the things, actually, there are not many things BRICS members actually agree on. There are a few big things, as Ayabonga also outlined. But one thing I think almost all BRICS members agree on is this question of unilateral sanctions. And now India can, weaponize interdependence too in its own ways, but nonetheless, they have seen this as a problem. So Russia, not just, I think it's the latest reason, but not the only one for many of these countries.
Mm. And Bonga, how do you see the decisions that were made in Kazan or that were not made, and what's the way forward when it comes to, for instance, agriculture, when it comes to the alternative payment system, or the view on sanctions? I guess South Africa shares India's view on this.
Well, I think maybe if I may start on the question of the currency, because one would imagine that here we've got a typical case of what begins as conjecture and ends as speculation. If one looks at the two past meetings of the BRICS summit, both Kazan and in Johannesburg, the language is quite similar insofar as the formal communique is concerned that comes out of this. So too has that been aligned to the responses of both the Indian and even, I guess in this case, the finance minister and some Indian officials as well, to say what is actually being aimed at here is not necessarily some BRICS currency, and I'm not sure where the currency idea emerges from. But really what the position is to encourage the use of local currencies and financial transactions between BRICS member states as part really of typical macroeconomic management in a way where there are certain, as I said, vagaries arising from global trade that arise for countries that might not be able to control the currency with which some of their needs are met. And I think much of the debate is really centering on the BRICS currency without having a discussion about, if people really want to have a discussion about de-dollarization, to what degree is price formation of many of the tradable goods across the world denominated in dollar as the reference currency, such that even if people were to move in the direction of de-dollarization, there would be fundamental and structural complications associated with that. So really, the debate around currency reform relates to ensuring that at least a growing share of transactions between these countries is undertaken in their own currencies of issue in order to really deal with the question of uneven balances of foreign exchange reserves, as Tanvi was saying, rather than a more sensational debate about really, is this about creating a new currency? And one understands, I guess, how and why this arises, precisely because I think of the geopolitical and even kind of the drums of war, and even this question of sanctions that you raise, which of course has never been something that is not costly. Certainly for countries that are reliant for some of their intermediate requirements for goods that they don't produce and that ostensibly they would buy in another currency. Let me maybe just come to this question on agriculture.
Yes,
because
this was important for South Africa, yes.
Oh, indeed, yeah. You know, agro-processing in South Africa is the largest employer in manufacturing in a country where we have a significant challenges of unemployment. But we are also in a BRICS body with many other members who are part of another group that we are part of, which is the Carlyle Group of large, agricultural producers. And so there are those complications and contradictions of South Africa being one of the largest, I guess, producers in the agricultural sense on the continent, in a continent visited by climatic and ecological and food insecurity risks that arise from that. And so in a way, you would see that within BRICS, there are certain commitments about not only what BRICS countries might agree on how do we deal, for instance, with trade distorting restrictions, such as some of the complicating, export bans that we've seen in the last while. And really, this also shows that BRICS, in a sense, is a living form of cooperation. No cooperation is just only kind of a nice Sunday school picnic. But part of the cooperation has to be between people who also have contradictory engagements among themselves. I'm at the helm of the Trade Commission in South Africa. Many of the anti-dumping measures that we investigate and that we adjudicate on as a commission deal with imports that arise from structural overcapacity coming out of China. That doesn't mean that we must eschew partnership with China. Similarly, in the agro-processing sector, many of our complications arise from Brazilian competition. They arise from competition in the Eurozone. Does that mean now we must now partition the world in clubby corners? Not at all. But it means that we must strengthen our institutions that give rise to dialogue and cooperation, such that we resolve these contradictions in ways that are much more functional and productive than some of the sensation in the debate might allow for. And I think the currency debate, similar to the agribusiness debate, South Africa approaches from that particular vantage point, that we do need to try and at least find one another before we start to scream at the beachheads or from the soapbox at one another.
Mm. You said, Tanvi, that one of the few things that everybody agrees on in the BRICS summit is the unfair consequences of the sanctions and the secondary effects of the sanctions, and that this is something that being addressed. There has also in the past been discussions about trying to change the voting rights system in international organizations such as the World Bank, IMF, and so on. Is this yet another subject where the BRICS could push more to find a joint position there?
I think, it's something, for example, that, as Mihaela said, China and India have cooperated. It's one thing both, for instance, have talked about, which is reform of global economic governance, and particularly for those two countries whose economies have grown significantly. But I think, one of the things I think with BRICS in general and international organizations, it's not clear to me that you will have necessarily a BRICS view because of some of the contradictions Ayabonga talked about. But what you could see is some BRICS members who have similarities on issues, working on particular issues, whether it comes out of the WTO, whether it comes out of G20, whether it comes out of from the global economic governance review. So, even on representation, as much as, a country like India says there's a lack of representation, they know that Russia at the end of the day does have that. And Russia and China, for example, do have representation in the UN Security Council as permanent, veto holding members. And so I think these are some of the things where I don't think you'll have a BRICS view, because the BRICS members itself sometimes are in different spaces, whether in terms of representativeness, whether in terms of their own view on that issue. So I think you will see member states working. So, for example, when India hosted the G20, I think I've lost track. I think it's probably a year ago, more than a year ago now. You saw on the sidelines of that, India, Brazil, South Africa, and the US hold a meeting on food security along with the World Bank. So it also is not necessarily saying these positions are going to be taken even among some member states against the West. Sometimes they are in finding like-mindedness with the West on particular issues. So I don't think you'll see kind of a BRICS as a whole, and especially since it's expanded coalition as a whole, when you have, for example, large consumers, large producers on things like agricultural goods, or, for example, energy or other commodities. So I think you'll see more kind of, even within, I think, much more issue-specific collaboration amongst specific member states, rather than kind of a BRICS coalition in any grouping.
Mm-hmm. And we touched upon all of you about enlargement. And in Kazan, there were a lot of countries present. Some of them might want to become former members. Some others are seeking out this, closer cooperation and trying to find ways where on individual items they might align. But there were countries such as Algeria, Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Turkey, Uganda, Vietnam, etc., in Kazan as well. So how do you become a member? Are there any criteria, any formal criteria? Should there be any formal criteria? Is this a good thing or a bad thing that other countries are trying to line up? Because, of course, with geopolitics and with the increasing conflict with China and US, but also, South and North conflict emerging, there could be an interest to try to, form stronger groups of interest in this. How do you see this, Michaela?
So there is a set of criteria. Actually, during the first enlargement, when South Africa joined, there were no criteria. South Africa pulled a very successful negotiation campaign convincing BRIC that it needs to be in. And at that point, it was South Africa wanting to join rather than BRIC saying, okay, this is the criteria for new members. But that
it was very nice to put the S at the end, no? BRICS.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. It will be more difficult with the others.
But then the situation changed, and in 2022, actually, it was China has always been the champion of expansion because China wanted to expand BRICS to make sure that there is more trade cooperation, to basically increase its scope and scale. And then at that time, BRICS was more open to membership. So what happened before 2022 and 2023 was a lot of countries expressed interest, but they weren't really clear what the criteria was. And then South Africa basically invited some countries, and it still wasn't published, like what are the criteria. But then eventually the list of membership criteria came out, and it includes like things like, you know, they need to have friendly relations with all BRICS countries. They need to have, they need to want to reform institutions. They need to be committed to sustainable development goals. What's important, they're not supposed to be sanctioning any of the BRICS members, and they're supposed to be increasing trade and investing in trade cooperation, and already have strong trade before they join. So that's one of the positively looked upon areas, that if you have strong trade, that gives you an extra like advantage when considering whether you will become a member. So I think the confusion right now is that first Russia said, oh no, BRICS is getting too big. We want to integrate the existing new members in 2024, and then we will pause membership for full-time members, so for full members. And then eventually there was so much interest, and there was eventually this like partner category. And at this point, it's not clear which partners will actually get in January of 2025 when Brazil takes over. Because what happened before was that, let's say we had Argentina, Saudi Arabia, and they were invited, and they were formally written in that they were invited, and then they're still not in. And Argentina withdrew, and Saudi Arabia is still considering. So now this is kind of a more pragmatic approach, that you do not announce them that they're in. You can say, yes, they're invited, but you don't say like they're joining, or count on them until there are further negotiations to say who is really in and who is just like in this like preliminary stage, trying to figure out whether BRICS is the right fit.
Hangarounds and wannabes, the different hierarchies there, like in other organizations. But of course, if some of these members were to enter, it would become more like a formal organization, which would push for more formal statements and more common actions. Maybe it might be easier to maintain the current group of members, and then have a looser form of network for cooperation in the different areas where you find. You said, Tanvi, that India was skeptical to enlarge with more members. Can you develop a little bit about that?
I think, you know, India on the question of enlargement, you know, I think they actually initially thought Russia and they were on the same page, which is they didn't want to expand. They wanted to consolidate. And then they said, okay, we're open to expansion, because they realized the other member states were going to push it, but said we should have definite criteria. And they felt that there didn't end up being, at least in that initial phase, as Mihaela said, now there is some talk of criteria. But they, you know, I think they felt that if you don't have criteria, then pretty much people will be trying to get their friends in. And so you see, eventually India said, and it's also because they have to maintain their bilateral relationships with all these aspiring members, and they don't want, you know, those members to say, well, China wants us in, but you're keeping us out. You saw India say, we actually never objected to expansion. Having said that, you saw India's concerns about potential expansion in Prime Minister Modi's, as I said, closing statement as BRICS. And usually these statements don't really say very much. But in this time in Kazan, you saw, you know, subtweeting in some senses, never said directly, but he said, you know, there was a line in there about ensuring that with expansion, that consent, even saying, okay, expansion is happening, but ensuring this remains a consensus-based organization as opposed to a majority vote organization. And second, saying the role of the founding members, the special role and views of the founding members must persist. And I think you see India's concern there, that as this grows, and they won't say it, but I think their big concern is that Beijing would push for majority voting, and not just because of Beijing, but just as there's expansion, that India, as well as Brazil and South Africa, might have their roles and influence within this organization reduced over time. And so I think you've seen both. I mean, this is another one of these balancing acts that India has to, not wanting to be seen as the obstacle to expansion, even wanting some of their, partners like UAE, and they would have liked to see, I think, Saudi Arabia and Argentina join as well. But nonetheless, they will want to see that certain things, for example, they will not want to see Pakistan join. They see China and Russia as endorsing that membership of the other rival. So I think some of this is really about the specifics of how expansion plays out. Just one other concern I think that India has had for many, many years, though they will manage it. India was a founding member of the non-aligned states. It was the Afro-Asian Summit at Bandung in 1955, and then there was a non-aligned within that. India never actually wanted a non-aligned movement because they thought it would just create a third bloc and that they would get forced into taking positions because the majority vote that actually ended up being against their own interest. So one thing India would not like to see is a large, unwieldy organization that actually becomes very formalized, that will drag India into taking decisions that are even potentially, take on an anti-Western hue, which India has zero interest in, because as close as it is to some BRICS countries, its closer economic ties, for instance, and technological ties today are with Western countries. So I think that formalization is something India will not want to see. It doesn't want to create an alt G20. And so what it will try to do is say, yes, we should have BRICS, but it will urge its Western partners, you need to invest more in showing up at the G20. You need to invest more in developing ties with the global South, and not just leave that to the BRICS as an organization, and that because otherwise it will get formalized as a bloc.
Interesting. How do you see that, Ayabonga, from South Africa's perspective? New members. Nigeria is one of the other countries who maybe have shown interest in joining.
No, indeed. I mean, I think ours is to welcome, yes, the interest from many African countries to join the bloc, and not necessarily for the kind of cloak and dagger, heroes and villains that people often try to frame it as. This view that, in Cold War espionage, you're creating kind of a third way and third bloc. I think our primary interest has always been that if there's a commonality and unity of interest in the principled agenda behind BRICS, then that is helpful. If a third of the global output, or countries who represent the third of the global output, are in concert and in song about the reform of the multilateral order, about the resolution of conflicts through dialogue, about enhancing economic, political, cultural, and other forms of exchange between countries across the world, are interested in kind of climate, energy, and digital transitions, are interested in the reindustrialization of parts of the world where development has been experienced in uneven ways. If all of those who express an interest in joining BRICS are in unity around those issues, that itself is a qualitative advance. We can then have a debate, of course, about what the kind of concrete balance of power might be among those who kind of will subsequently join, and what that means for those who are incumbents in the mix. But to some degree, that becomes quite academic when we are faced with a moment globally where we have to mount a collective response to problems that no longer recognize kind of the strictures or the limits of nation-state boundaries. We've come out of one now with a pandemic. We are faced with many other non-medical challenges in the world that require a common response. Climate change is one of those. And so in a sense, I think if we are wanting to kind of pick out and sharpen the areas of divergence, I'm not sure that might be as productive an exercise as to understand in much more deeper ways what are the areas we agree on and how will those find expression at a nation state level, at a regional level, and of course at multilateral fora. One of the people in the comments is raising something quite important. That
On
to what
WTO.
degree then, Alejandro, I think, in the chat,
Yes.
asking a question about whether or not many BRICS member states from the start have ever had a cohesive view on matters such as international trade and WTO reform. And I think it's an important point because if you go back to the 13th ministerial in Abu Dhabi, there would have been areas that were discussed there where the BRICS members would have diverged. But there were many other areas where the BRICS members, alongside other parties who are not party to BRICS, both in the global south and even Western countries, where there was broad agreement. So I think there is a need for us to be able to identify and harness, yes, those areas where there might be productive divergence. But also we have to recognize that this history of creating alliances among many people who might have different views is very unique to the experience of countries in the global south following the Second World War. You know, in a way, Tanvi raises the Afro-Asia Conference as one example. But I think for us in South Africa, we've developed quite a different understanding from our own objective experience about how you harness and manage difference, not as something that kind of must break us from what we commonly understand as common objectives that are shared among us. And yet, of course, we must deal with our own differences. But how we deal with those does require that we underscore the importance of collective and collaborative action along the areas where there is at least a minimum set of principles around which we agree. And so the concern that, you know, if you have many people joining, it will dilute that kind of ethos, I think would be maybe experienced if you would have a BRICS that is so comfortable in the incumbent global order that there is no agitation for reform. Then you must know that the BRICS is no longer the BRICS. But if you read the agitation and advocacy for reform, if you read the composition of those who sat in Bandung and many of those who are wanting to join BRICS, it is a commonly shared experience of particular forms of alienation from how the global order has been configured following the Second World War. And in many ways, your earlier point about more than a third of output coming from these BRICS countries also realizes that the material relations of power in the world have also shifted from what we saw in 1945. And yet our institutions have certainly not shifted alongside that. And that's something that we need to address. It's not wrong for some of the countries who are already, for instance, in a very advantageous decision-making powers in that global order to agitate for its change. Because it's not only those who are receiving the short end of the stick who must agitate. Our experience and our traditions say that even those who must argue from a position of relative privilege are also charged with the obligation and duty of solidarity. And my understanding certainly of those who have attempted to attend the BRICS, have expressed an interest in joining it, is that they at least are in concert about some of these common experiences of alienation from the global reform system, of course, to varying degrees.
That's a very valid point. And if we look today, when the whole world is threatened by massive tariffs from the new Trump administration, I mean, that would target not only BRICS.
Well, you are likely to see
100%.
maybe that coalition of the wounded widening.
Exactly, that was what I was going to come to, because not only has incoming President Trump threatened BRICS with 100% tariffs if you move to a new alternative currency system, but also targeted individual countries. And I, who sit here in Europe, we are also trying to prepare for different scenarios, obviously. So if we look a little bit forward, we are coming close to the hour, a little bit forward, what could, with this pressure, and pressure, outside pressure has a tendency to sort of create a good environment for other types of cooperation, because you have a common enemy, so to say. How would you see the coming years of Brexit, if you speculate a little bit about the future? Would you like to start, Michaela?
Yeah, sure. I see BRICS going stronger because there are more and more areas where they agree. I see one thing that we haven't mentioned much is climate change in the context of trade. So if we look at Kazan declaration, there is a concern of carbon border adjustment mechanism. So that is in a way a convening power. Of course, and also BRICS now started with framework memorandum of understanding of climate and sustainable development and carbon markets. So I see climate really in the next 4 years with future President Trump's agenda on climate and like both EU and BRICS agendas on climate, that would be one issue to watch. So I think, but more generally, in terms of president-elect, I see a major change in policy because US traditional policy was always to emphasize we have strong bilateral relations with BRICS countries, and Jake Sullivan before said like they're not a geopolitical threat. And now you have basically President Trump, before even coming to office, looking at BRICS as one entity and saying not only they are a threat, but we are actually doing something about it. So that's a major like shift in policy.
Interesting. Tanvi?
I think, in some ways this moment will make BRICS more sustainable, but I'm not quite sure it'll make BRICS necessarily stronger. And I think that's because at the end of the day, and when I look at it and how India is likely to see it, India has an interest in deepening alignment with the US, but it also has an interest in diversifying its partnerships. And within that, it'll double down on groupings like BRICS. But that also means that when India sees it as its own interests, vis-a-vis the US or vis-a-vis anybody, they will break with the BRICS in some ways, and not kind of take necessarily a collective view. So you've already seen, the US, India talk about being different from perhaps other BRICS members. But you also, for example, see perhaps BRICS members will not necessarily take the same view of a Trump administration. They'll have their own bilateral, dynamics. UAE, for example, is not going to take the same view as a Brazil, and neither is Trump going to take a same view on each. So he might have made a collective statement, but I think in practice it's going to be kind of more individual. And it doesn't, his views on BRICS don't seem to have stopped him from actually talking about what countries would call a G2, potentially China and the US sitting down and resolving all the problems of the world, in which case everybody else is less represented, not just, where does Europe fit in for that? So there, Meher is right. Europe and a lot of the global South might actually feel more less represented in that view. So I absolutely agree. I think there will be certain issues that will go from other, from more global platforms, for the US that's less interested in investing in addressing, the consequences of climate change. That will go to other groupings, to other bilaterals, to unilateral actions. So I don't think, so that's why I think, you'll see such groupings be more sustainable, but I think the jury's out on whether or not it'll be stronger, because everyone, or I shouldn't say everyone, but most of the BRICS members, when it comes down to it, are going to choose their interests over, any group solidarity when it comes to specifics, in my view.
Bonga, do you have any final remarks on this?
Well, thank you very much, Cecilia. Well, I would imagine that the definition and characterization of the South African interest is inextricably wound up with the quality and character of the collaborations we have. And I think BRICS is an important part of that. But it's also not important because people set up bodies to collaborate and meet every year because it's a nice soiree. But I think we need these institutions because, as South Africa observes, the world is confronting a series of overlapping and mutually reinforcing crises, from climate change, perennial underdevelopment, inequality, hunger, unemployment, technological change, geopolitical instability, war, epidemic. All of these issues require the deepening of collaboration and collective action across nation-state boundaries. Yes, indeed, there remains the space and domain for people's own and the nation's own narrower set of interests. But I think the world has changed such that many of those interests can be spatio-territorially extended to something much wider than one nation state. Even among those nation states who have large populations, if you were to whittle down at a level of detail, many of their interests are commonly shared with other countries that might not necessarily have their kind of share of voice or share of the global population. So certainly for us, very much our own presidents of the G20 is about deepening the forms of collaboration and collective action. And of course, only time will tell, and the wheel of history will tell whether or not the BRICS itself, as an outcome of that, emerges much stronger. I think even that will be an outcome of the balance of kind of conjunctural factors and how the scene develops. Yes, there is the question of some of the changes. 2024 was a big election year, and there have been many changes that will change the constellation and configuration of power. But the principles remain the principles, that we have to ensure that there's continuous dialogue on issues of mutual concern. We deal with questions of unilateralism, be it in the security domain, in the trade domain, and in other areas that do require collective interests, be those ensuring that there are syringes with vaccines in the context of an epidemic, or ensuring that there is food to all of those who need food, irrespective of whether maybe the marketplace might, in an allocative sense, mean that some of those might not be able to access that food. Those are the principles we are interested in. And insofar as I think the BRICS is an expression and an amplification of those interests, it is in the objective interest of South Africa to continue to be a part of BRICS, and of course to agitate for a wider cross-section of the global world to also be behind the same objectives, whether they are part of the bloc or not.
Wow. This has been so interesting. I think we could keep on talking for quite a while. There are so many different aspects that we haven't had time to touch upon. But we're at the hour. Michaela Papa, Tanvi Madan, Ayabonga Dave, thank you so much for your participation. You've been very generous with sharing your views and expectations on this. And to those of you watching, happy holidays and a happy new year. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.